Welcome to the vast and fascinating world of incredible stories by Niall Davis. We hope you enjoy this one as much as everyone else has. Written by Niall Davis and produced by Defcon Eagle. This evening, we proudly offer The Knock at Midnight, a chilling tale of a late-night visitor with sinister intentions. Enjoy and stay tuned for more captivating stories.
Chapter 1. The Knock. It started as a faint sound, barely more than a tap against the heavy wooden door of her apartment. At first, Eliza thought little of it. She lived on the third floor of a crumbling old building where every creak and groan felt like part of its charm, or so she had convinced herself when she signed the lease. The knock came every night, just as the clock struck 12, and it was so soft, so unassuming, that she assumed it must be a neighbor's prank or the idle antics of kids who slipped in through the building's perpetually broken side door. Eliza worked long shifts at the diner 2 blocks over, her feet aching from the endless parade of customers who expected a warm smile with their overcooked eggs. By the time she trudged up the dim stairwell to her apartment each evening, she was too exhausted to care much about the knock. She would roll her eyes, lock the deadbolt, and crawl into bed with the faint sound still scratching at her nerves. She told herself it wasn't worth losing sleep over. Life was too busy to let her imagination get the better of her. Weeks passed, and the knocking continued, unchanging in its rhythm and timing. Midnight, 3 slow, deliberate taps. Always 3. It became a routine annoyance, like the dripping faucet in her bathroom or the rattling pipes when the heat kicked on. She even tried to tune it out with music, pressing her headphones tight against her ears, but the faint, methodical sound seemed to creep through the walls. She complained to her best friend, Eliza, during one of their rare nights out. "You should have told the landlord," Eliza said, leaning over the bar to shout above the music. "Or, I don't know, maybe call the cops." "That's creepy as hell, Liza." Eliza laughed it off. "It's nothing, probably just some bored kids." But deep down, the knock unsettled her. There was something too precise about it, too deliberate. It wasn't the kind of sound a person made by accident. Still, life had a way of burying her unease beneath the weight of everyday struggles, late rent, double shifts, and the loneliness that came from living in a city where everyone seemed to have somewhere else to be. Then one morning, as Eliza shuffled out to grab the newspaper from the communal stack by the mailboxes, she overheard 2 neighbors whispering by the stairwell. Mrs. Carver, the widow from 3B, hadn't been seen in days. Her blinds were still drawn, her mail piling up. Eliza felt a pang of guilt. She had meant to check on Mrs. Carver after noticing how frail the older woman had looked the last time they crossed paths in the hallway. She'd even thought about bringing over a tin of cookies she had left over from the diner. The guilt only deepened when, hours later, police cars pulled up outside the building. Officers came and went, their radios crackling with low murmurs. By evening, rumors spread like wildfire. Mrs. Carver had vanished. No signs of forced entry. No note. Just an empty apartment with a half-drunk cup of tea still sitting on the counter. People speculated wildly. Had she wandered off? Had someone taken her? The uncertainty made the air in the building feel heavier, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little too far. That night, Eliza's unease sharpened into dread. The knocking came, as always, but this time she froze in place, standing just feet from the door. The sound was louder than before, the rhythm slower, almost taunting. She clutched her phone, her thumb hovering over the emergency dial. But fear, irrational and paralyzing, kept her rooted to the spot. After the 3rd knock, silence returned, and she finally exhaled, her breath shaky. She glanced at the door, half expecting to see the knob turning. Nothing happened, but the sense of foreboding lingered long after. She hardly slept that night. By morning, she decided to take action. She stopped by the precinct on her way to work, clutching her coat tight against the early autumn chill. The officer at the desk, a weary man with dark circles under his eyes, listened to her story with polite detachment. When she mentioned the knocking, his expression shifted ever so slightly. "You're not the first to report something like that," he said, his voice low. "We've had calls about unusual activity in your building for weeks. People hearing noises, finding locks tampered with. If I were you, I'd make sure all your doors and windows are secure. And if it happens again, don't wait. Calls right away." Eliza nodded, her stomach twisting. She felt exposed, as though the walls of her apartment could no longer shield her. The officer's words looped in her mind all day, drowning out the clatter of plates and the hum of the diner. Every sound felt amplified, the scraping of a fork against the plate, the shuffle of footsteps behind her. That night, she double-checked every lock and even wedged a chair beneath the doorknob before retreating to her bedroom. She stared at the clock, the minutes dragging by, her body tense with anticipation. Still, the knock came. Midnight. 3 deliberate taps. She didn't move this time, didn't breathe until the clock on her nightstand blinked 12:01. The following days blurred into a haze of anxiety and sleepless nights. Then, a discovery, one that turned her unease into sheer terror. While scrolling through the local news, she stumbled upon an article about the police's investigation into Mrs. Carver's disappearance. A single detail stood out. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store showed a hooded figure lurking outside her building on multiple nights. The caption beneath the grainy image read, "Suspect believed to have targeted specific apartments." Eliza's heart raced as she reread the article. Targeted, the words seemed to leap off the screen. The knocks at her door were no prank, no random act of mischief. Someone had been testing her, waiting for a moment of carelessness. And now, with Mrs. Carver gone, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that the knocking had been more than a warning. It had been a countdown. That night, she didn't wait for the knock. As the clock neared midnight, she sat in her living room, phone in hand, her breathing shallow. She jumped at every creak and groan of the old building, her mind racing through every worst-case scenario. The first tap came, faint but unmistakable. Then the second. Her hands trembled as she dialed. The operator's voice on the other end was calm, a lifeline she clung to. By the time the third knock echoed through the apartment, she whispered into the phone, "Please hurry." Chapter 2. The Stranger in the Shadows. The days following Eliza's frantic midnight call to the police passed in a haze of mounting tension. Each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the old pipes, made her heart race. She hardly left her apartment except for work, and even there, her co-workers' chatter seemed muted, distant, like white noise fading into the background. The officers who responded that night had done little to ease her fear. They'd arrived quickly, their presence a brief comfort in the suffocating stillness of the hallway. One officer, a younger man with sharp eyes and a clipped tone, checked her locks while the other, a veteran with a graying mustache, asked her questions she couldn't fully answer. "Have you seen anyone suspicious hanging around?" "No, I'm usually at work during the day." "Have you heard any other noises apart from the knocks?" "No, just that, every night, at midnight." The younger officer nodded toward the peephole in her door. "Why didn't you check who it was?" Eliza flushed, ashamed to admit she had been too afraid. "I didn't want them to know I was here." The veteran gave her a sympathetic smile. "That was the right call. Whoever it is, they're trying to get a reaction. Best not to give them one." They'd left her with reassurances and a promise to increase patrols in the area. But it wasn't enough. The knock didn't come the next night, or the night after that, but Eliza knew better than to think it was over. Whoever had been testing her wasn't finished. On the third day, something shifted. Eliza arrived home from her shift at the diner to find a note slipped under her door. It was a single sheet of plain white paper, the edges slightly crumpled. The handwriting was neat, precise, as if each letter had been carefully drawn. "You should have answered." Her stomach dropped, and she stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The note dangled from her trembling fingers as she scanned the dimly lit hallway. Empty, silent, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, hidden just out of sight. She shoved the note into her pocket and slammed the door behind her, throwing the deadbolt and securing the chair under the knob as she had every night since the knocking began. Her hands shook as she dialed Alyssa's number. "Liza?" Alyssa's voice came through, warm but tinged with concern. "What's wrong?" Eliza swallowed hard. "It's happening again. Someone left a note this time. They know I didn't answer the door." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Alyssa spoke again, her tone firm. "You need to get out of there. Stay with me for a while. It's not safe." Eliza hesitated. She wanted nothing more than to pack a bag and leave, to escape the suffocating fear that had taken hold of her apartment. But a stubborn part of her refused. If she ran now, she'd never feel safe again. "I'll think about it," she said finally, though she already knew she wouldn't. That night, she forced herself to stay awake, determined to catch whoever had left the note. She sat in the darkened living room, her phone clutched tightly in one hand and a heavy frying pan in the other. Midnight came and went, and for the first time in weeks, there was no knock. She exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. But then she heard it. A faint shuffling sound outside her window. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, and there was no fire escape on that side of the building. Slowly, carefully, she rose from the couch and crept toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of moonlight filtered through the gap between them. Holding her breath, she reached out and pulled the curtain aside. Her blood ran cold. A figure stood on the fire escape across the alley, partially obscured by shadows. They wore a dark hoodie, the hood pulled low over their face, and they were staring directly at her window. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if time had frozen in that terrible instant. Then the figure raised a hand and mimicked the knocking gesture, 3 slow, deliberate taps against the air. Eliza stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. She fumbled with her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. By the time she managed to explain what she'd seen and the police arrived, the figure was gone. The officers searched the alley and surrounding area but found no trace of the intruder. One of them, a young woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stayed behind to check the locks and windows with Eliza. "Do you know anyone who might want to scare you like this?" she asked. Eliza shook her head. "No, I keep to myself. I don't even know most of my neighbors." The officer nodded, her expression grim. "Whoever this is, they're escalating. Don't hesitate to call us if anything else happens. And seriously consider staying somewhere else for a while." But Eliza didn't leave. She couldn't explain why, even to herself. Part of her felt tethered to the apartment, to the life she'd built within its walls. Another part of her feared that running would only provoke whoever was tormenting her. And so, she stayed. She didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Each evening, she watched the window, waiting for the figure to return. But they didn't. Instead, the knocking resumed. Midnight, 3 deliberate taps. And then, one night, something new. A single piece of paper slipped under her door. This one had no words, only a symbol, a circle with a single line drawn through it, bisecting it like a twisted version of a clock. The countdown had begun. Chapter 3. The Realization. Eliza had always been a rational person. She prided herself on her ability to approach life's challenges with logic and calm. But as she stood in her living room the next morning, staring at the faint scuff marks on the inside of her door, marks she hadn't noticed before, her steady demeanor began to crumble. The police had come and gone after the midnight call, their polite yet clinical efficiency doing little to ease her nerves. They inspected her apartment, checked the locks, and took her statement. But they found no immediate evidence to suggest someone had entered. Still, the lead officer's parting words haunted her, "Keep your phone close. And if anything happens again, don't hesitate to call us." Anything happens again, the phrase echoed in her mind as she traced her fingers over the scuffs. They were subtle, easy to miss unless you were looking for them. But now, every scratch and groove felt like proof of a silent threat. Someone had tried her door, perhaps many times, and left these marks as a grim reminder of their persistence. Her unease grew with each passing hour. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the privacy of her own home. The curtains stayed drawn, and every small noise, the groan of the radiator, the distant hum of traffic, set her on edge. By midday, the oppressive weight of isolation had become too much to bear. She grabbed her coat and decided to take a walk, hoping the crisp autumn air might clear her mind. The streets outside were alive with the mundane bustle of city life. People hurried past her, their faces buried in scarves and their minds preoccupied with errands and schedules. Eliza envied their obliviousness. She stopped at a corner coffee shop, ordered a chai latte, and found a seat near the window. The warmth of the drink helped steady her nerves, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that she might be overreacting. But as she sipped her latte, a movement outside caught her eye. Across the street, a man in a grey hoodie stood leaning against a lamppost. His face was obscured by the hood, but there was something about his posture that set off alarm bells in her mind. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, at least, but his presence felt deliberate, like he was there for a reason. Eliza's grip tightened around her cup. She told herself it was a coincidence. This was a busy city, after all. People loitered all the time. But when she stood to leave, the man straightened, his movements fluid and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Her heart raced as she pushed open the door and stepped onto the sidewalk. She glanced back toward the lamppost, but the man was gone. Her walk home felt like navigating a maze of shadows. Every corner seemed to hold unseen eyes, every sound a whisper of danger. She clutched her keys tightly, the sharp edges digging into her palm like a makeshift weapon. By the time she reached her building, she was out of breath, her chest tight with a mixture of fear and frustration. Inside her apartment, she locked the door and leaned against it, willing herself to calm down. She couldn't keep living like this, jumping at shadows and seeing threats where there might be none. But as she double-checked the locks and wedged the chair back under the doorknob, she knew the unease wouldn't simply vanish. That evening, she called Eliza up. Her friend's cheerful voice on the other end of the line was a small comfort. "You're not crazy, Liza," Eliza said after hearing the day's events. "But you can't handle this on your own. Have you thought about staying with someone? Maybe your parents or another friend?" "I don't want to leave my apartment," Eliza replied. "This is my home. I shouldn't have to run because some creep." She trailed off, her voice cracking. "Then let me come stay with you," Eliza offered. "At least for a few nights." Strength in numbers, right? Eliza hesitated, torn between wanting the comfort of her friend's presence and the fear of putting Eliza in harm's way. Finally, she agreed, and by nightfall, Eliza arrived with an overnight bag and a bottle of wine. The two friends spent the evening catching up, trying to push the tension to the back of their minds. They laughed over old memories, their voices filling the apartment with a warmth that had been missing for weeks. But as the clock crept closer to midnight, the laughter faded, replaced by a quiet, shared anticipation. When the first knock came, both women froze. It was softer than Eliza remembered, almost tentative, but unmistakable. 3 deliberate taps. Midnight. Eliza's eyes widened, and she grabbed Eliza's hand. "That's it, isn't it?" Eliza whispered. Eliza nodded, her pulse thundering in her ears. They waited, every second stretching into an eternity. But no second knock followed. The silence was almost worse than the sound. Finally, Eliza stood and walked to the peephole, her movements cautious and deliberate. She pressed her eye to the small glass circle, her breath fogging the door. "There's no one there," she said after a moment, her voice barely audible. Eliza exhaled, a shaky relief washing over her. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. The knock had come every night for weeks, unchanging in its pattern. Tonight was different, and that difference felt like a warning, a prelude to something worse. Chapter 4. In the light of day. The next morning, Eliza was gone. Eliza woke to the sound of sunlight streaming through the blinds, the apartment eerily quiet. For a brief, blissful moment, she thought the night before had been a dream. But the empty wine glasses on the coffee table and Eliza's crumpled blanket on the couch told a different story. Her heart sank as she scanned the room, calling out her friend's name. "Eliza?" Her voice echoed through the apartment, hollow and unanswered. The bathroom door was open, the small space empty. The kitchen was undisturbed, save for the mug Eliza had used for tea the night before. Eliza checked her phone, hoping for a text or missed call, but there was nothing. Panic bubbled in her chest as she thought back to the knock at midnight. Had it been a mistake to let Eliza stay? Had she unknowingly put her best friend in danger? She searched the apartment, her movements frantic, but there was no sign of Eliza. Her bag was gone, as were her shoes, but Eliza knew her friend wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. The realization sent a cold wave of dread through her. Something was wrong. She dialed Eliza's number, pacing the small living room as the phone rang and rang. When it finally went to voicemail, she tried again, her fingers trembling. Still no answer. Eliza clutched her phone, willing it to buzz, to light up with a call or message that would explain everything. But the silence was deafening. By midday, she couldn't bear the uncertainty any longer. She called the police, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. The officer on the other end listened patiently, but Eliza could hear the skepticism in his tone. "Ma'am, it's possible your friend left early and forgot to let you know," he said. "Have you tried contacting her family or other friends?" "She wouldn't just leave," Eliza insisted. "Not without saying something. She knew how scared I was." Her voice cracked. "She wouldn't do that." The officer promised to file a missing persons report and send someone to check in later that day, but Eliza could tell he didn't share her sense of urgency. Frustrated, she hung up and sank onto the couch, her mind racing. She scrolled through her messages with Eliza, looking for clues, anything that might hint at what had happened. But their last exchange was from the night before, filled with casual banter and plans for breakfast. Hours passed in a haze of worry and helplessness. Eliza couldn't bring herself to leave the apartment, afraid of missing a call or a knock at the door. When the knock finally came, it was past dusk, and it wasn't the deliberate, taunting knock she had come to dread. It was quick, urgent. She rushed to the door and peered through the peephole. A uniformed officer stood in the hallway, his expression serious. Eliza opened the door, her heart pounding. "Did you find her?" she asked, hope and fear colliding in her chest. The officer hesitated, glancing down at the clipboard in his hand. "We've spoken to some of her family and friends," he began carefully. "So far, no one has seen or heard from her since last night. But we're treating this as a priority case. Can you tell me more about what happened?" Eliza recounted everything, from the knock at midnight to Alyssa's insistence on staying with her. She described the strange man she'd seen outside the coffee shop, the scuff marks on her door, and the overwhelming sense of being watched. The officer took notes, his pen scratching against the clipboard, but his face remained impassive. "Do you think it's connected?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To the knocks? To Mrs. Carver? We're exploring all possibilities," he replied, his tone measured. "But I'd advise you to stay vigilant. Keep your doors and windows locked, and don't hesitate to call us if you notice anything unusual." Unusual. The word felt almost mocking. Everything about her life felt unusual now, twisted into something unrecognizable. The officer left, promising to keep her updated, but his reassurance did little to ease her growing fear. That night, Eliza couldn't bring herself to sleep. She sat in the living room with the lights on, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Midnight came and went without a knock, but the silence was no comfort. It felt heavier, more oppressive, as though the absence of sound was its own kind of threat. The next morning, Eliza made a decision. She couldn't keep waiting for answers, couldn't live in a state of constant fear and uncertainty. If no one else was going to figure out what was happening, she would have to do it herself. She pulled out her laptop and began searching for anything that might connect the strange occurrences in her building. Missing persons, break-ins, unexplained disappearances. She scoured local news archives, online forums, and community message boards, piecing together fragments of information. What she found sent a chill down her spine. Over the past year, there had been a series of disappearances within a 5-block radius of her building. All of them were women, all living alone or with minimal connections to the neighborhood. The reports were sparse, the details vague, but one thing stood out. In each case, neighbors had reported hearing strange noises, knocking, tapping, scraping, in the days leading up to the disappearance. Eliza stared at the screen, her heart pounding. It wasn't just her. The knocks, the scuff marks, the shadowy figure outside the coffee shop, they were all part of something bigger, something far more sinister than she had imagined. And now, Alyssa was part of it too. Chapter 5. The Shadows Beneath the Surface. The morning after Eliza's discovery, the world outside her apartment seemed oddly unchanged. Children played in the courtyard, the distant hum of traffic carried on as usual, and sunlight filtered through her curtains with an almost cruel sense of normalcy. But Eliza's mind was anything but calm. The whispers she had heard in the hallway the night before still clung to her like a fog, obscuring every rational thought. She spent hours pacing her living room, replaying the muffled voices in her mind. It wasn't just the words but the tone, furtive, conspiratorial, that unsettled her. Who were they, and why did the mention of Alyssa's name feel like a thread pulling everything apart? Determined to find answers, Eliza decided to leave her apartment. She stuffed her phone, a small notebook, and a pen into her bag before heading down the stairs. The building felt oppressive, its shadows longer than usual. Each creak of the floorboards beneath her feet made her flinch. She avoided the elevator entirely. The fun of being trapped in such a confined space made her stomach churn. Her first stop was the landlord's office. The landlord, Mr. Grayson, was a reclusive man with a penchant for ignoring tenant complaints, but Eliza hoped he might provide some insight. She knocked sharply on the glass door, peering into the cluttered space beyond. After a long moment, the door creaked open. "What is it?" Mr. Grayson asked, his voice gruff. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with sunken cheeks and a perpetually furrowed brow. "I need to ask you about Alyssa Morgan," Eliza said, trying to steady her voice. "She's my friend, the one who disappeared. Did you notice anything unusual before she went missing? Any visitors? Strange behavior?" Grayson's frown deepened. "I already told the cops everything I know," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Quiet girl, paid her rent on time. Didn't cause trouble, that's all I can tell you." "What about her apartment?" Eliza pressed. "Did anyone go inside after she vanished?" Grayson hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the hallway. "We had to clear it out," he admitted reluctantly. "Her lease was up, and no one came forward to claim her things. "Place is empty now, can I see it?" Eliza asked, her heart pounding. Grayson shook his head. "Can't let tenants poke around other units. Against policy." "Please," Eliza urged. "There might be something in there, something the police missed. I need to know what happened to her." Grayson sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Fine," he muttered, "but if anyone asks, you didn't get the key from me." Eliza nodded quickly, barely able to believe her luck. She followed Grayson to a small cabinet where he retrieved a worn key labeled 4C. Handing it to her, he muttered, "Be quick." The walk to Eliza's old apartment felt interminable. When she finally reached the door, her hands trembled as she fit the key into the lock. The door swung open with a faint creak, revealing a space that was eerily sterile. The furniture was gone, and the walls were bare, but the faint scent of Eliza's favorite lavender candles still lingered. Eliza stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. At first, there was nothing, just an empty shell of a home. But as she moved toward the bedroom, something caught her eye. A single sheet of paper lay on the floor near the closet. She picked it up, her breath catching as she read the words scrawled in Eliza's familiar handwriting. "It's not the knocking, it's what comes after." Eliza's blood ran cold. The cryptic message sent a chill down her spine, and for a moment, she felt like the walls were closing in around her. She stuffed the note into her bag and hurried out of the apartment, locking the door behind her. As she descended the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the building felt like an ominous warning. By the time she reached the street, her hands were clammy, and her pulse was racing. Back in her own apartment, Eliza sat at the kitchen table, staring at the note. What had Eliza meant? What came after the knocking? The question gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. Unable to shake her unease, she decided to do something she hadn't done in years. She called her mother. The familiar warmth of her mother's voice steadied her, if only slightly. They talked for nearly an hour, mostly about mundane things, work, the weather, distant relatives. Eliza didn't mention the note or the knocking, but as they said their goodbyes, her mother's parting words stuck with her. "Sometimes, the answers we're looking for are closer than we think. You just have to be brave enough to face them." Eliza stared at the phone long after the call ended. Her mother was right. Whatever was happening, whatever Eliza had tried to warn her about, Eliza knew she couldn't keep running from it. She had to face the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Chapter 6. The veil begins to tear. The following days passed in a blur, with Eliza scarcely leaving her apartment. She avoided the hallways, avoided the front door, and jumped at every shadow that shifted outside her windows. Her phone became her lifeline, always within arm's reach, its screen lit with messages from Eliza urging her to stay safe and call if she needed help. The text exchanges were a small comfort, but the isolation of her tiny apartment pressed in on her like a vice. Then, late one evening, as Eliza attempted to drown her unease in an old movie marathon, her phone buzzed. The screen displayed a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she debated letting it go to voicemail, but a sudden, irrational compulsion made her pick up. "Hello, Eliza?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, deep and steady, with an edge of urgency. "This is Detective Martinez. I need to ask you some questions about the night you called us." Her pulse quickened. "Detective Martinez? I already gave my statement to Officer Halston." "I know," he replied, his tone softening slightly, "but there have been developments. Do you have a moment to talk?" Eliza hesitated but ultimately relented. "Yes, of course." Martinez explained that the police had reviewed security footage from the building and surrounding areas. The grainy videos revealed a shadowy figure pacing the block in the hours leading up to Mrs. Carver's disappearance. The same figure was later spotted slipping into the building's side entrance at precisely 11:48 p.m. on the night Eliza had called. "We think whoever this is knows the layout of the building," Martinez said. "They've avoided cameras inside, but they've been seen around the complex multiple times over the last month." Eliza felt a chill crawl down her spine. "And you think this person is connected to Mrs. Carver?" "We can't say for sure," he admitted, "but the timing is suspicious. We're looking into everyone who's come and gone from your building recently, and we've increased patrols in the area. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay vigilant and avoid being alone outside at night." She thanked him and ended the call, but his words lingered long after the conversation ended. Someone had been watching, someone knew her routines, her habits. The thought was suffocating. The next morning, Eliza forced herself out of bed, determined to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. She made a grocery list, gathered her tote bag, and prepared to face the world outside. But as she stepped into the hallway, she was struck by a sense of wrongness. The air was heavy, and the usual sounds of the building, muffled conversations, distant television static, were absent. She paused at Mrs. Carver's door, the crime scene tape still stretched across its frame. A faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic creak, like the groan of a rocking chair. Her skin prickled, quickening her pace. She descended the stairs and exited onto the street. The sunlight felt foreign after so many days in the dim confines of her apartment. She completed her errands in record time, her eyes darting to every passerby, every parked car. By the time she returned, her nerves were frayed. As Eliza stepped into the lobby, she noticed something on the bulletin board near the mailboxes. Among the usual flyers for babysitting services in local events was a small, handwritten note. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged, but the message was clear. Some doors should never be opened. Her hands trembled as she tore the note from the board and stuffed it into her pocket. The elevator ride to her floor was suffocating, the walls closing in as her paranoia mounted. When she reached her apartment, she double-locked the door and slid the chain into place. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her ears straining for any sound beyond the hum of her fan. At exactly midnight, the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate taps. But this time, something was different. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the faintest whisper of movement, the creak of a floorboard just outside her door. Her breath hitched as she reached for her phone, her hands shaking so badly that she fumbled it onto the floor. As she bent to retrieve it, a soft scraping sound echoed through the room. It was coming from the window. Eliza froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she turned her head. There, just beyond the glass, was a shape, vague and indistinct in the darkness. A face pressed close enough to fog the glass with its breath. And then it smiled. Chapter 7. The Edge of Sanity. The smile on the figure's face lingered in the reflection of the window for a breathless moment before it disappeared. Eliza blinked, her heart hammering in her chest, unsure if her exhausted mind was playing tricks on her. She crawled across the floor, away from the window, her phone clutched tightly in her trembling hands. She dialed 911, whispering her address to the dispatcher with a voice barely above a rasp. "Someone is outside my window," she said, tears stinging her eyes. "Please, send someone, please." The dispatcher's calm, practiced voice assured her that officers were on their way. Eliza huddled in the corner of her bedroom, her back pressed against the wall, listening for any sound that might betray the intruder's presence. Minutes felt like hours. When the knock came again, this time at the door, she nearly screamed. 3 deliberate taps. "Eliza?" A voice called. "It's Detective Martinez." "Open the door." She hesitated, her instincts torn between relief and suspicion. Rising cautiously, she peered through the peephole. There he was, Detective Martinez, his face lit faintly by the hallway's flickering light. She unchained the door and opened it just enough to see him fully. "Detective," she said, her voice shaking. "Someone was at my window." Martinez raised a hand to calm her. "Let me in. We'll talk inside." She stepped aside, and he entered, his movements brisk but not rushed. Martinez scanned the room, his eyes landing on the window. He approached it, careful not to disturb the curtain. "You said someone was outside?" he asked, his tone steady but tense. "Yes," she whispered. "I saw a face. They smiled at me." Martinez nodded, pulling out his radio. He called for backup and ordered a patrol of the building's perimeter. "We'll find out who it was," he said, turning back to her. "But Eliza, I need to know if you've noticed anything else." "Anything unusual, no matter how small." Eliza swallowed hard. She thought of the note on the bulletin board, the eerie silence in the building, and the sense of being watched that had plagued her for days. "There was a note downstairs," she said, retrieving it from her pocket. It said, "Some doors should never be opened." Martinez studied the paper, his expression darkening. "Did anyone see you take this?" "I don't think so," she replied. "But I don't know who put it there." Martinez exhaled sharply. "We've been getting reports like this from other tenants. Notes, strange noises, missing items. Whoever this is, they're escalating." Escalating, she repeated, her voice breaking. What does that mean? It means they're getting bolder, Martinez said, his voice grave. And more dangerous. A knock at the door startled them both. Martinez motioned for Eliza to stay back as he approached, hand resting on his holstered weapon. He opened the door cautiously to reveal two uniformed officers. They exchanged quick updates before one of them stepped into the apartment. We didn't find anyone outside, the officer said, his tone apologetic. But there were footprints near the fire escape. Fresh ones. Eliza's stomach churned. The fire escape led directly to her window. Martinez turned to her. Do you have somewhere else you can stay for a while? A friend or family member? She shook her head. No, this is my home. I can't just leave. Then we'll have someone posted here tonight, Martinez said firmly. You're not alone in this, Eliza. We'll find whoever's doing this. But his words offered little comfort. Even with the officer stationed outside her door, sleep was impossible. She lay in bed, clutching her phone, every creak of the building setting her nerves on edge. The windows seemed to loom larger in the dark, a fragile barrier between her and the unknown. Sometime after 3 a.m., just as she was beginning to doze, a sound jolted her awake. It wasn't the knock this time, nor the creak of the floorboards. It was a whisper, a low, rasping voice calling her name. Eliza. Her blood turned to ice. She clamped her hands over her ears, willing the sound to stop. But it came again, louder this time, and impossibly close. Eliza, open the door. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The voice was inside her apartment now, circling her, taunting her. When she finally opened her eyes, she was alone in the room. But the whisper lingered, echoing in her mind long after the sound had faded. The veil between her reality and the nightmare was tearing, and she could no longer tell which side she was on. Chapter 8. Beneath the surface. The morning light did little to ease Eliza's nerves. She paced her living room, clutching a steaming cup of coffee that she could barely bring herself to sip. The events of the previous night played on an endless loop in her mind, the smile, the whispers, the creeping sense that her sanctuary was no longer safe. Detective Martinez had promised to follow up, but Eliza knew that whatever was happening went far deeper than the police could see. By late morning, Martinez called to inform her that they'd be reviewing the building's security footage. Stay home today, he urged. I'll let you know as soon as we have something. Eliza agreed, though the idea of staying locked inside her apartment filled her with dread. The walls felt too close, the air too still. She forced herself to focus on something, anything, to distract her from the lingering fear. She grabbed a box of keepsakes from her closet, deciding to sort through them as a way to pass the time. Inside the box were fragments of her past, old photographs, letters, and knickknacks that had followed her from place to place. She smiled faintly at a picture of herself and Eliza at the beach, their faces sunburned but happy. Beneath the photo was a letter from her mother, written shortly after Eliza had moved to the city. The familiar looping handwriting brought a lump to her throat. As she reached deeper into the box, her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. She pulled out a small, leather-bound journal that she didn't recognize. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed. She opened it cautiously, her heart skipping a beat as she realized it wasn't hers. The first page bore no name, only a single, chilling sentence written in shaky handwriting, "They're always watching." Eliza flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. The entries were fragmented, scattered thoughts and cryptic warnings. "The knocks are not random," read one. "They test you, they wait." Another entry detailed shadowy figures seen in reflections, just beyond the edge of perception. The final page sent a cold shiver down her spine. When the whispers come, it's already too late. Her breath caught as a realization dawned on her. The journal must have belonged to Mrs. Carver, or someone else who had lived in the building before her. She tried to recall if Mrs. Carver had ever mentioned anything unusual, but their conversations had been brief and polite, limited to exchanges about the weather or deliveries left in the wrong place. A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. She froze, the journal slipping from her hands and landing on the carpet with a muffled thud. 3 deliberate taps. She glanced at the clock. Noon. It wasn't the usual midnight routine, but the sound was identical, calculated, mocking. "Eliza," a voice called. It was Martinez. Relief flooded her as she rushed to open the door. The detective stood there, his expression grim. "We found something," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She gestured to the journal on the floor. I found something too, she said, her voice unsteady. It's not mine, but... Martinez picked up the journal, flipping through its pages quickly. His face darkened. Where did you get this? It was in my things, she said. I don't know how it got there. He studied her for a moment before nodding. This matches some of the notes we found in other apartments, he said. The same handwriting. Whoever wrote this has been watching this building for a long time. What did you find? She asked, her stomach churning. Martinez hesitated. The security footage, he said. It shows someone entering the building through the side door last night. They were wearing a hood, but they seemed to know the layout. They went straight for the fire escape. Her blood ran cold. Did you see their face? Not clearly, he admitted. But we're running it through the system. In the meantime, we're increasing patrols in the area and stationing an officer here tonight. Eliza nodded, though the words felt hollow. The journal in Martinez's hands seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, its warnings no longer abstract but painfully real. She couldn't shake the feeling that the person, or thing, behind all of this was always one step ahead. As Martinez left to follow up with his team, Eliza sank onto the couch, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The knocks, the whispers, the journal, it all pointed to something far more menacing than she had imagined. And somewhere deep inside, she knew the worst was yet to come. Chapter 9. Eliza's Revelation. The weight of dread settled over Eliza like a shroud, the journal's revelations and the escalating events fueling a premonition that something terrible was about to happen. The journal, a potential key to understanding the events unfolding around her, felt strangely significant. She couldn't shake the feeling that her apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a trap. She had to leave, to find a place where the shadows couldn't reach her. Grabbing a duffel bag, she hastily packed essentials, clothes, phone charger, journal. The leather-bound journal felt strangely significant, a potential key to understanding the events unfolding around her. She paused, considering her options. Alyssa's apartment was empty, a grim reminder of her friend's disappearance. Her parents' house was too far, the drive too risky with her nerves on edge. An image flashed in her mind, the coffee shop. It was bustling, full of light and life, the opposite of her darkened apartment. It might offer a temporary haven. With renewed determination, she slung the duffel bag over her shoulder and headed out. The hallway was empty, the silence amplifying her unease. She hurried down the stairs, avoiding the elevator, and slipped out of the building. The coffee shop was a comforting buzz of activity. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and chatter filled the air. Eliza found a corner seat, her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room. She pulled out the journal, her fingers tracing the worn leather. Opening it, she began reading, hoping to decipher the cryptic messages. The entries were a jumble of fear and paranoia, but amidst the chaos, a pattern emerged. The writer, presumably Mrs. Carver, believed the building was haunted, not by a ghost, but by something far more sinister, a presence that fed on fear and isolation. Eliza's pulse quickened. The knocks, the whispers, the shadowy figures, they weren't random acts of terror. They were a calculated game, designed to break down the residents, to make them vulnerable. A chilling thought struck her. Alyssa hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken, lured away by the whispers, by the promise of an answer to the mystery. Eliza's mind raced. She had to do something, to stop this before someone else vanished. But what? The police were dismissive, and she had no proof, only a journal filled with cryptic warnings. A sudden commotion at the entrance caught her attention. 2 police officers entered, their faces grim. They approached the counter, speaking in hushed tones to the barista. Eliza's heart pounded. She watched as the barista pointed in her direction. The officers turned, their eyes locking onto hers. Dread washed over her. Had they come to take her away? To dismiss her fears as delusions? She braced herself as they approached, her hands gripping the journal tightly. The taller of the 2 officers spoke first. "Eliza," he asked, his tone surprisingly gentle, "we need to ask you some questions about the events at your building." She hesitated, unsure how to respond, but then she remembered Alyssa, remembered the fear in her friend's eyes. "I know who's behind it," she said, her voice firm. "I can help you stop them." Chapter 10. The Unveiling. Eliza's revelation hung heavy in the air, the coffee shop's bustle fading into a distant hum as the officers exchanged glances. The taller one, Detective Miller, spoke first, his voice cautious. You said you know who's behind it. Can you tell us more? Eliza hesitated, the weight of their skeptical gazes pressing down on her. She clutched the journal, its worn leather a source of comfort. It's not a who, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It's a what, something, not human. The officer's expressions remained unchanged, a practiced neutrality that Eliza found both frustrating and terrifying. Eliza, the second officer, Detective Jones, interjected, we understand you've been through a lot, but we need concrete evidence. Names, dates, anything tangible. Eliza took a deep breath, steeling herself. It's the building, she stated, her voice gaining strength. It's been here a long time, feeding off the fear and isolation of the tenants. The knocks, the whispers, they're all part of its game. She recounted the journal's entries, the patterns she'd observed, the escalating events that culminated in Eliza's disappearance. The detectives listened intently, their initial skepticism giving way to a flicker of unease. And you believe this entity, Detective Miller began, his voice laced with disbelief, is responsible for the disappearances? Eliza nodded, her gaze unwavering. It's not just me. The journal, the notes, the whispers, they all point to something sinister at work. She paused, her next words hanging heavy in the air. It's not done, it's waiting, watching, for the next victim. A tense silence filled the corner of the coffee shop. The detectives exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Detective Jones spoke, his tone measured. We'll look into this further. In the meantime, Eliza, you need to come with us. For your own safety. Eliza hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to flee, to disappear into the anonymity of the city. But then she thought of Eliza, of Mrs. Carver, of the empty apartments and unanswered questions. She had a chance to stop this, to break the cycle of fear and isolation. I'll help you, she said, her voice firm. But we need to act fast. It's already planning its next move. As Eliza followed the detectives out of the coffee shop, a shiver ran down her spine. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching for her, but she held her ground. She had faced the darkness, and she would not back down. The final chapter of this story remains unwritten, the ending shrouded in uncertainty. But one thing is clear, Eliza's journey into the heart of the unknown has only just begun.
Thank you for listening to this story by Niall Davis and Defcon Eagle. We hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories. If you want to be notified when we release a new one, hit that bell. Have a wonderful day. Until next time.